September the 15th, 1916, the Battle of the Somme. The 7th Battalion Middlesex Regiment prepares to go over the top. One company is led by Captain Douglas Hurd.
Dear Mr. Hurd, it is with the deepest regret that I have to inform you that your son was killed in the attack of the 15th. Our battalion was assaulting the hostile positions when there were signs of a counterattack to our right. He moved out his Lewis guns to meet it, and whilst observing the results of their fire, was shot through the head. Not only have I lost in him a most valuable officer, but I have also lost a personal friend whose companionship was always a pleasure to me. I'm sorry to say that on the 15th, our battalion was met with that tragedy which has befallen so many other battalions in this war, and that we have to deplore the loss of very many of our officers and men. I pray that you and your family will accept the deepest sympathy of myself and of the few officers now left to me in your deepest sorrow. Yours very sincerely, Colonel E.J. King.
My grandparents made an album to remember their eldest son. The most moving part of the album are the letters written in pencil from the trenches nearby. The sergeant and the corporal didn't have to write in their careful, sloping hand good things about the young man with whom they'd served. They did so, it was part of the spirit of the time. They didn't write about the slaughter which surrounded them day by day. There are 500 British buried in this cemetery, most of them killed within a day or two of each other. 20,000 British were killed on the first day of this Battle of the Somme, and it went on month after month. For us British, these fields are the killing fields. The scale of the slaughter remains astounding, but so does something else. The strength and the deep roots of the society which enabled this army to move forward. So that in this cemetery and in hundreds of cemeteries like it are buried not just the soldiers, but the values of the strong society which sustained them. My uncle lived in an age whose values were very different from our own. 4 years before the war, Edward VII's coffin was followed in London by a throng of emperors, kings, presidents. Some ruled with elected governments, others solely by the grace of God. They governed a patchwork of races whose loyalty, by and large, they held. They were rivals, roughly equal in strength. War had been kept at bay more or less by this balance of power. It was the emotional Kaiser, Wilhelm II of Germany, who upset this balance. He lacked the judgment needed to preserve it. He failed to keep Germany on reasonable terms with Russia and started a pointless naval arms race with Britain. So Britain, France and Russia spun a web of alliances against him.
The situation was created which, however a war broke out, for whatever cause, it would become generalized. And in fact, it was an obscure issue in the Balkans that forced the outbreak of World War I.
Sarajevo, then part of the Austrian Empire, now pretty well known to all of us. The heir to the Austrian throne, the Archduke, was paying a visit when a Serb nationalist, out to wreck the old empire, stepped off the curb and shot him. Immediately, all the alliances were triggered. First, Austria marched on Serbia, calling on German support. They were met by the 3 million troops of the Russian Tsar. This triggered the Tsar's alliance with France. Germany attacked France through Belgium, and so Britain was obliged to come in. you don't have to go far to find memories of the war. I learned mine here at Eton College. After it was over, it was christened the Great War, and rightly, because it was different from anything that had gone before. At Eton, of the 5,000 who fought, 1,500 died, and this scale of slaughter was repeated in every town and village. In total, 15 million were killed. Under the strain, the undemocratic empires, Austria, Russia, Germany, collapsed. Britain and France came through, but scarred, weakened within themselves, like so many of the individuals who survived. I find these memorials particularly moving because it's not just one long list of names. Each family had its own memorial, its own design, and its own farewell message. And the messages really were very simple. These young men were volunteers. Their country was in danger, they went and fought for it, and eventually they died for it. But as the slaughter went on, as Ypres became, the Somme became Passchendaele, the message changed. Patriotism was not enough anymore. People began to think that a completely new way of doing things was needed. The diplomats, the chiefs of staff, the balance of power had failed. We needed something new. I don't suppose the people who gathered round these plaques when they were unveiled knew exactly what was needed, but they were open to new ideas. And those ideas came in a surge, really a sudden surge, across the Atlantic from the United States and from Woodrow Wilson.
We take our hats off to you, Mr. Wilson.
Woodrow Wilson was the 28th President of the United States.
You're the man of the hour. You stood like a tower. You know what to do for the red, white, and blue. You're the right kind of man in the right kind of place. Like Washington and Lincoln, you set a pace. They know at home and abroad. Your pen is greater than the sword. I was over in Europe and I know how terrible everything is. We take our hats off to you.
Woodrow Wilson's house in Washington gives you some idea of the man and his impact. For Wilson's ideals still resound. They're the driving principles of American foreign policy even today. This is a house of a man of solid Christian values. A merciful man, as the house shows. But the key to Wilson is his library with its walls of legal texts. He believed that moral principles could be enshrined in law, which should replace the cynicism of the balance of power.
I believe that a nation's foreign policy should be based on moral considerations. And by moral considerations, I mean principles of right and wrong that guide behavior. And I think, having said that, most political realists, most foreign policy experts would disagree with me.
That American morality told Wilson that war was a product of injustice. If the system of alliances permitted unelected kaisers and tsars to treat their people as cannon fodder for their own ambitions, it was unstable and should be scrapped.
For Americans, it was inspiring because Americans have never had security problems, or certainly didn't have at that time. So they like to think of politics as a moral rather than as a very practical enterprise.
Peace could last forever, Wilson said, but only if the world was a little more like America, governed by principles of justice, with human rights and democracy for all. Woodrow Wilson believed in human nature. He believed that people could deliver peace with justice. He thought that wars were caused by the old-fashioned tangle, the tangle of kings, emperors, alliances, secret diplomacy, the balance of power. If you could sweep all that wretched muddle away, then you could make the fresh start for which everyone was pining. In their place, you put self-determination, the right of everybody to choose which country they belong to, which government would rule them. And you put collective security, by which Woodrow Wilson meant the League of Nations, all the countries of the world coming together freely and peacefully to discuss their problems. And the weight of public opinion, what people thought, being strong enough in itself to prevent any aggression. This was, I suppose, the full flood of American idealism under its president, coming at its strongest across the Atlantic when Europe was at its weakest. And so it was that in January 1917, Woodrow Wilson committed America to the war. But in doing so, he made a great ringing call for idealism. The time had come, he announced, for the new world to give morality back to the old.
America has been cried awake by these voices in the disturbed and reddened night, when fire sweeps sullenly from continent to continent. And it may be that in this red flame of night, there will rise again that ideal figure of America, holding up her hand of hope and guidance to the people of the world.
First, he denounced all alliances and said the whole system of the balance of power should be outlawed.
Is the present war a struggle for a just and secure peace, or only to secure a new balance of power? There must not be a balance of power, but a community of power, not organized rivalries, but an organized common peace.
The principles of human rights and democracy would govern dealings between nation-states.
No nation should seek to extend its polity over any other nation or people, but that every people should be left free to determine its own polity, its own way of development, unhindered, unthreatened, unafraid, the little along with the great and powerful.
The machinery of war must be dismantled.
There can be no safety and equality among nations if armaments continue here and there to be built up and maintained.
Empires should be broken up, their people set free.
No rights exist to hand peoples from sovereignty to sovereignty as if they were property.
Wilson announced that everything that had gone before was nonsense. And I do not know one significant American figure who said, how do you know this? But there was no test that any of these principles of Wilson had ever been applied, or even any analysis of how it would work in practice.
At last, the war ended, and an exhausted world seemed ready for Wilson and his 14-point plan for peace.
My earliest memory is of a city exploding with joy. The date was November 11, 1918, Armistice Day. I was 2 years old. The city was...
You remember that?
I do indeed.
Where were you?
I was in San Francisco. The city was San Francisco. I can remember it because the people were just exploding. For example, the streetcars were running up and down the streets not far from my home. People were riding on the roofs of the streetcars. Why? Obviously because we felt we'd won World War I. But more fundamentally, many Americans believed, as Woodrow Wilson did, that we'd fought a war to end all wars. How wrong we were.
So Wilson took his crusade to Europe.
From Thomas Nelson, United States Ambassador to Rome. Mr. President, your name was not only applauded wildly, but continually chanted. An old woman was heard to say that there was a great saint who was making peace for us. By the common people, you are adored.
The hope he inspired in London was described by H.G. Wells.
For a brief interval, Wilson stood alone for mankind. He was transfigured in the eyes of men. He ceased to be a common statesman. He became a messiah. Millions believed him the bringer of untold blessings. Thousands would have died for him.
In Paris, they turned out in hundreds of thousands. But watching with the tired wisdom of old age was the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau.
President Wilson, inspired prophet of a noble ideological venture to which he was unfortunately destined to become a slave, had insufficient knowledge of the Europe lying torn to pieces at his feet. He acted to the very best of his abilities in circumstances the origin of which escaped him, whose ulterior developments lay beyond his ken.
Woodrow Wilson obviously was an idealist. And when he offered his so-called 14 points, when was it? October, I guess, 1918, the Germans tended to believe him. But later on, Wilson's idealism did not find any echo, neither in Paris nor in London, nor elsewhere, if I'm not mistaken, in Europe.
I think it achieved a popular echo, but governments didn't know how to handle it.
Yeah,
It was contrary to their tradition.
A popular echo, but no echo in Whitehall or in the Élysée.
Certainly, there was no echo with Clemenceau. He knew about the balance of power, the need to weaken Germany and strengthen France so that her borders would always be secure. Collective security, it meant nothing to him. He trusted alliances and the force of arms.
Clemenceau était un homme assez âgé à l'époque. C'était un homme qui s'était battu avec tout le monde, d'ailleurs qui était très dur avec ses adversaires. C'était le tigre. Et un tigre qui donnait des coups de patte. Et il avait joué un rôle incontestable pour aider à ce qu'on gagne la guerre, à partir de l'année dite l'année terrible où les choses allaient très mal. Alors je crois qu'il était absolument obsédé par l'idée qu'il fallait rester dans une situation de force.
Wilson entered the Paris peace talks determined to destroy all alliances and the balance of power and convince everyone to join his ideal of the rule of law under the League of Nations. The realist Clemenceau refused unless he received his alliances, and who can say he was wrong?
La France se méfiait de cet idéalisme, parce que la guerre lui avait coûté très cher humainement, comme d'ailleurs la Grande-Bretagne. Ce sont les deux pays qui avaient supporté, dans notre camp bien sûr, le poids humain le plus lourd. Et le slogan français, c'était qu'il ne fallait plus qu'il y ait de nouvelles guerres, que l'idéalisme ne suffisait pas, et qu'il fallait essayer de l'empêcher.
Crowds waited for weeks as realist and idealist clashed. Wilson despaired.
The hungry expect us to feed them, the roofless look to us for shelter, the sick of heart and body depend upon us for a cure. What I seem to see, with all my heart I hope I am wrong, is a tragedy of disappointment.
Eventually, he had to compromise. The Treaty of Versailles was a compromise between idealists and realists, which satisfied neither and turned out a disaster. Clemenceau allowed Wilson his League of Nations. In exchange, he was given a demilitarized Germany. And in the Hall of Mirrors, the German delegation was told that Germany was guilty of starting the war and would have to pay reparations to France and Britain. So the treaty, meant to create the first just peace, sowed the seeds of the next war.
The greatest impact of World War I onto the Germans was not the war in itself, but the Versailles Treaty, which was judged by the Germans living at the time as being unjust. And particularly the clause in which the Germans were condemned to be guilty of World War I. I myself think all of them were guilty, including the Austrians, including the Russians, including the French, maybe the British less than the others.
Wilson had more success with his ideal of self-determination. In Poland, they even unveiled a statue to him. The defeated empires were broken up into nation-states and their people allowed to choose their own governments. But even then, there were problems.
It turned out that under the new dispensation, as many foreign people, or as many people were under foreign rule as there had been before, simply because it was not technically possible.
The mosaic is what the mosaic is.
Exactly.
You can't sort it out, no. But for the moment, the cheering went on. What no one expected was that of all the architects of Versailles, it was the idealist Wilson who was to let everyone down. Even as the American president took the applause, the American Senate was laying plans to reject the treaty. America was about to abandon the brave new world which she had created.
The French and British went along with a lot of things that in their heart of hearts they didn't really believe in order to obtain American support. And the peace settlement was made before it was obvious that we would not join the League of Nations. So they were stuck with a settlement that could only be maintained, in fact, with American support.
Wilson died 3 years later, a broken man but mourned by millions. Ironically, it was the American moralism that he'd wanted to give the world, which was used against him.
The isolationism of the 20s was based on the proposition that we were too good for this world and that we would get contaminated if we got ourselves involved in these European quarrels.
Meanwhile, in Europe, life returned to normal, except, of course, that everything had changed.
Yes, sir, that's my baby, do, sir. Don't be baby, yes, sir, that's my baby now.
Attitudes to many things were different in the 20s. Life was certainly freer. Fun was fashionable. There was a new morality. And in Geneva, there was the League of Nations.
The number of treaties registered and published to date is 4,068.
There, treaties were lodged and registered, their texts easily available for public scrutiny. A bureaucracy was set up. International laws were drafted and translated into the languages of the 42 member states. No aspect of the law would be too small.
That you, Samson? I wonder if you can tell me the meaning of an obscure Finnish word I've got here. I think it's perhaps something to do with fishing tackle.
But above all, there was the Council, where Wilson's peace-loving, alliance-free world was meant to take shape, as countries sorted out their problems by reason alone. The League of Nations built itself a great palace here in Geneva, with symbolic works of art, long corridors, plenty of meetings, and idealism. People had at last realized that international security, world peace, were worth a collective effort. But there was no backup. The idea of an alliance, of staff talks, of guarantees, all that was rejected as part of the disastrous past. We're used to the idea of NATO. We believe that NATO is needed to plan for contingencies, to make deterrence credible. To them in the 20s, it would have seemed a thoroughly risky, bad project. After all the suffering of the First World War, they believed that public discussion, public opinion by itself, would be enough to prevent a second. Reality hit home almost immediately. In 1923, hyperinflation racked Germany, which stopped reparations. France, acting alone, sent in her troops to occupy the Ruhr. In the name of upholding Versailles, she had seized the opportunity to weaken Germany still further. it was an old-style act of power politics.
La France, à ce moment-là, a décidé de prendre un gage. Et elle a envoyé son armée, ce qu'on a oublié, occuper la Rhénanie. Ceci, ça a dû se produire dans les années 24, je crois. Et d'ailleurs, c'est la raison pour laquelle moi je suis né en Rhénanie, parce que mon père était dans les forces françaises qui occupaient ce gage. Mais la France a été isolée. Personne d'autre n'a agi, ni les Américains, ni les Britanniques, ni d'autres.
Something had to be done to shore up the New World Order, so the main European countries met in Locarno, Switzerland. French Foreign Minister Briand aimed to secure France's borders with something stronger than the League. Germany looked for a new deal. And the British just hoped to keep out of all this European stickiness. The Locarno Treaty was an unreal hybrid of the old and the new. Germany was admitted to the League. Britain couldn't give France an alliance, as alliances had been banned, but it gave her the next best thing, a guarantee. Only France would guarantee the borders of the new countries in the east. As the British Foreign Secretary muttered,
"For the Polish corridor, no British government ever will or ever can risk the bones of a British grenadier."
So security in British terms was selective rather than collective.
Conservatives governments, on the whole, you would know better than I, didn't really take the world society idea terribly seriously and were always looking for British interests, although I think the idea that there are no permanent principles, only permanent interests, is bunkum.
Certainly at the League, the principle of peace reigned supreme. Indeed, Briand was carried away.
Plus de guerre. Nous n'acceptons pas que dans aucun cas, pour aucune cause, dans aucune circonstance, la guerre que nous avons clouée au pilori comme un crime puisse se réveiller contre les peuples.
Terrific. The international community really did believe that words alone could rid the world of war. So the upshot was another pact in which 65 countries promised never to go to war. Wilson would have been proud.
With the solemn declaration which we have all made in the Kellogg Pact that war is not a legitimate way of settling international disputes, progressive international disarmament all over the world becomes the logical consequence of the new international order. We ought not to want armies and navies, but at the most police forces, to deal with uncivilized tribes or lawless members of the community of nations. Such a reform would mean a vast saving of money, an immense increase of international confidence, and a proclamation that henceforth justice and not violence was to reign in international affairs.
So the passion for peace was followed by the passion for disarmament, particularly in Britain, where the Royal Navy and defence spending were cut, saving money and satisfying the new morality of Britain's answer to Briand, the Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald.
And we are going to go to Geneva to get the nations of the world to join in and reduce this enormous, disgraceful burden of armaments which we are now bearing from one end of the world to the other. And so, in 1932, the nations of the world did descend on the League with the best of all possible intentions. At the time, it seemed wholly genuine.
I may venture to make concrete suggestions. The Japanese delegation are in favor of reduction in the size of battleships and in the caliber of their guns.
But there was a new force at large. In 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany and immediately took her out of the Geneva talks, out of the League. He had a rather different view about the value of peace.
Mankind has grown strong on eternal struggles and will only grow weak on eternal peace.
Instead, he began a massive rearmament program. The League chose not to act, but placed its faith in Wilson's idealism. Surely, reason would prevail, the people of Germany would restrain their warlike leader.
There are lunatics in every country who really want the attempt to organize peace to be abandoned. No one doubts that disarmament is possible, but the common man wants to know whether the governments with great military, naval and air forces are really in earnest in their desire for peace.
But the glamorous Anthony Eden, Britain's League of Nations minister, began to express doubts.
I have watched some of these ingenious contrivances which have occupied the minds of international statesmen for too long, while the more sinister spirits of selfish nationalism and outworn jingoism were gaining in the background. As well use a mousetrap to catch a goblin.
The end came for the League in a series of hammer blows. First, Japan invaded China. The League issued a report condemning the aggression.
Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East and to contribute to the maintenance of peace throughout the world. Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
And with that, Japan just walked out of the League and out of all its obligations. The League discovered that it could do absolutely nothing about it. Next, the Italian dictator, Mussolini.
Il popolo italiano balzerebbe con un solo uomo in piedi.
In 1935, he sent Italy's armies into Abyssinia in a clear act of aggression. The Emperor Haile Selassie mobilized against him. With two of its members now at war, this was the test of the League and of collective security. Should the League mobilize a force against aggression? Or was it a greater evil to resort to war? And if not force, what could it do? Something must be done, they said in Britain, in a phrase I later got to know well, but not if it meant fighting.
I'd fight tomorrow if I thought a war would end war, but that's what they told my father in 1914, and we're no better off now.
When there's a quarrel between two people, the police are called in to settle it. Why can't the League of Nations be strong enough to settle disputes between two nations?
Permanent peace can be secured by discussion. I've no quarrel with Frenchmen or Germans or Russians or anybody else for that matter. So let's be sensible and work together for peace by reasoning.
The League looked to Britain for a lead. Britain chose not to go to war, but to try a new weapon, sanctions.
There is, in our judgment, no disputes between nations that cannot be settled by peaceful means. We are prepared now, as in the past, ourselves to seek such methods.
Predictably, sanctions failed. America wouldn't apply them. Britain and France, fearing an attack by Mussolini, wouldn't impose them where it might have really hurt, on oil. So Abyssinia was swallowed up.
To Geneva on the 30th of June, 1936, came the man without a country.
It was left to Haile Selassie to shame the League.
The League's delegates had failed him.
He went to Geneva to show the world the consequences of not matching aspirations with action.
It is a question of the very existence of the League, of the trust placed by states in international treaties, of the value of promises made to small states that their integrity and their independence shall be respected and reassured.
Of course, they all applauded, but it was really a funeral oration for the League. Seizing his moment, Hitler reoccupied the Rhineland. France invoked Versailles and called for war. Britain, always dubious about the justice of Versailles, preferred appeasement. Give Germany back its territory and Hitler will respond to reason. France, thus isolated, froze. This was the best opportunity to stop the Nazis, and it was missed. The British were not willing to act.
No.
Do you think that France would have acted if the British had been a little more enthusiastic?
I think so, because it was a real debate, and by honest evaluations, the French forces and the French and British forces were very superior at that time to the German army. So it was not a very risky operation, and by the documents we have, probably Hitler would have backed
down. Yeah.
Back down, yes.
Hitler now broke Versailles more seriously, interfering in the Spanish Civil War by lending his air force to Franco's fascists. Eden despaired.
We shall reach a point where force and force alone is to be the sole arbiter of international relations, and where no treaty will be worth the paper on which it is written. There is a spirit of violence abroad in Europe today, which bodes ill for the future, unless all the restraining and responsible influences in humanity are brought to bear to check it.
What could the Foreign Office have done? Its great staircase illustrates the gap between idealism and reality. The dome is filled with images of the League, its members in harmony and reason. The walls show a Britain powerful enough to enforce a just peace on the world. But Britain had disarmed. Wilson had said that reason would always prevail, the good would always be strong enough to control the aggressor. But reality just doesn't work out like that. So Britain and France were left in moral, intellectual confusion, not sure of themselves, not sure of their material strength, not sure even of the willpower of their own people, facing dictators who had no such confusion because they were sure that might was right. Britain had an energetic, determined Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, who thrashed about against the odds to try and make appeasement work. One of those who travelled part of the way down that road was Anthony Eden. But Eden resigned in 1938 over policy towards Italy. And when that happened, as Churchill recorded, the gathering darkness became even more threatening. Enter Neville Chamberlain, the man in the moral trap. Czechoslovakia, one of the new countries in Eastern Europe, was his undoing. The Czechs and Slovaks had been freed from the Austrian Empire in 1919, and they'd produced a country which was rich, democratic, friendly, a fine product, it seemed, of Wilson's ideal of self-determination. Except that it also contained 3 million Germans demanding union with Hitler. So which had the better moral claim? The territorial integrity of Czechoslovakia or German self-determination?
Let's go back to Wilsonian idealism. A very large part of it was national self-determination. How did you distinguish that from the 3.5 million Sudeten Germans not being happy as part of, they all lived together, they weren't a sort of scattered minority in Czechoslovakia. So on the principles of Wilson, they ought to be allowed their self-determination, which was to go back to Hitler.
For Hitler, now at the height of his powers, there was no moral confusion. He was perfectly happy to threaten war against the Czechs and anyone who supported them. Try as he might, Chamberlain could not escape the dilemma. The Germans had a case for self-determination, but so did the Czechs, who could call upon Britain's support under the League's collective security. But that would mean war. And so he turned his back on idealism and plumped for old-fashioned self-interest.
How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. However much we may sympathize with a small nation confronted by a big and powerful neighbor, we cannot, in all circumstances, undertake to involve the whole British Empire in war simply on her account.
I wasn't happy with the way the Czechs were treated and the way it was handled, but I mean, I certainly didn't dissent from the Chamberlain policy of avoiding war, if possible. I mean, that was, after all, realistic and idealistic at the same time.
Berghof is the name given to this retreat, and here Herr Hitler was waiting to receive his guest from Britain.
Chamberlain reverted to 19th century great power diplomacy. Like one of the old emperors, he agreed to carve up Czechoslovakia. He gave Hitler the Sudetenland. No Czech was present, no Czech was consulted.
They walked up the steps with a frank and friendly talk, two men carrying between them the fate of 20 million.
No one even mentioned the League or collective security.
I don't think, certainly not in my mind, dealing as desk officer with Germany, we never sort of thought, there is the League of Nations, and we better bring them into play, because, I mean, frankly, it wouldn't have...
By that time,
it was impossible.
At the time, everyone seemed grateful to Chamberlain. They wrote a song about it.
God bless you, Mr. Chamberlain. We're all mighty proud of you. You look swell, holding your umbrella. All the world loves a wonderful baller. So carry on, Mr. Chamberlain. You know we're all with you. And when we shout, God bless you, Mr. Chamberlain, our hats go up to you.
From William Lyon Mackenzie King, Prime Minister of Canada, to Neville Chamberlain, my colleagues join me with unbounded admiration at the service you have rendered mankind.
Telegram from Robert Menzies, Prime Minister of Australia. Australians, in common with all other peoples of the British Empire, owe a deep debt of gratitude to you for your unceasing efforts to preserve the peace.
Me go to war for Czechoslovakia? Why should I? I should leave my business to begin with.
Yes, everyone was grateful to Chamberlain. Apart from the Czechs, who saw their country pulled to pieces. And then there was a slowly spreading sense of shame.
I don't think, to be fair to politicians, they have much time to sort of, am I ashamed or am I not, because they've got to deal with the crisis. I mean, that's the thing people tend to forget. And I mean, you know, we in the Foreign Office, I mean, we don't have much time to be sort of having discussions on, is this an ideal policy or is it not, or does this fit in with the balance of power or doesn't it? Perhaps we ought to have more time. We don't.
But at least Chamberlain used the time. He stepped up the rearmament program, which undoubtedly helped Britain win the war. No one should condemn him outright. Certainly on the left, they were equally confused. They rejected Munich, but they also opposed rearmament. Among them, a young student, Dennis Healey.
There were lots of people who wanted to stand up to Hitler, in a sense, without accepting the inevitable consequences of that. But that was a strong view in the Labour Party. It was not the only view. And, of course, there was a much stronger view in the Tory Party that didn't want to stand up to Hitler at all.
But that's very hard to argue when you and others tried to prevent Chamberlain from introducing conscription, tried, in fact, to prevent, even at the last minute, the rearming of Britain.
I did myself at that time, but I recognised almost within the hour when I spoke at a meeting asking for this with Frank Pakenham, oddly enough, Frank Longford as he now is, in Oxford, that it was a terrible error, because I remember a young man, older than me, of course, I was only about 21 then, saying to me, but do you remember the Oxford Union vote in 1936 against fighting for king and country? What impression do you think this will have? And I realised I'd made a terrible mistake.
But that's the sort of mistake, surely, that progressive people made, not just in Britain, all through the interwar years. On the one hand, they wanted the moralistic approach. They wanted the League to succeed. They wanted collective security, but they didn't want the teeth.
No,
they didn't want, and it's that,
no,
that contradiction surely
great,
was one of the things which undermined those decades. It came back to the lessons of the Somme. The poets, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and the novels, All Quiet on the Western Front, had done their work, maybe taught their lesson too well. In the name of peace, we had disarmed. We'd ignored the truth about Hitler. We'd abandoned the Czechs. This is the British Empire Memorial to the Battle of the Somme in the First War. It remembers in particular more than 70,000 soldiers from all over the empire who were certainly killed here, but whose bodies were never found. As the losses piled up, ideas about war changed. At the beginning, the general idea was wars happen from time to time. The important thing was not to lose. By the time this memorial was built, the conviction had changed. War had to be avoided at all costs. The first set of ideas may have led us into the Great War of 1914. The second idea, that war had to be avoided at all costs, certainly led us into the war of 1939. In working on the affairs of nations of the world, you need compassion, you need idealism, but we have to balance that with courage and with realism if we're not to come to grief. In March 1939, Hitler seized all Czechoslovakia. He then threatened to turn on Poland. Chamberlain issued an ultimatum. Hitler ignored it. After all, why shouldn't he? Chamberlain had deserted the Czechs to save the peace. Now he lost the peace as well. Once more, the fires swept across Europe. Only this time, it was even worse. There were now ways of striking directly at cities and civilians. A fifth of the population of Poland was wiped out. 20 million Russians died. Coventry and London were blitzed. 100,000 died in one night in Dresden alone. But the total human cost of the failure of collective security can never be counted. Millions of refugees snaked across Europe, fleeing the advancing armies. And this time, there was an evil beyond all imaginings. So, after 20 years, the idealism of Woodrow Wilson finally died at Auschwitz.
Next week, the rise of America and the Cold War at the same time.